Today I'm going to be making my Marnie Corset Apron. I've cut out all my pieces. I've got this beautiful floral for the main part of the apron. I've got a nice contrast for the pocket, and I have made 2 lots of continuous binding for my apron. I've got a narrow binding, so this was 2.5 centimeters when open for the boning channels, and for the binding around the edges I've used 4 centimeter binding, which I have folded into half and half again, and I'll be using that for all the bound edges. So let's get started. To start with, I'm going to prepare my pocket piece. There is 1 pocket on this apron. You could have 2 if you wanted, but I just like the way it looks with a single pocket, and that means that it's asymmetrical. So in order not to get confused, I like to start by pressing up the seam allowance towards the wrong side so that I remember which is the right side. Next, I'm going to take my bias binding that I've made, and I'm going to sew this bias binding in 1 pass. In the instructions, I show you how you can open out the bias binding, stitch it to the wrong side, and fold it over and bring it over. And by all means, that's fine. You might feel a bit more secure sewing that way, but you might also like to have a go at just doing it in 1 pass. So the way I do it is I like to get the bias binding started under the machine. I've just got a regular stitch length. I do a few stitches to get it started, and then I lift the foot and slide the edge of the material into the fold of the bias binding. Then I wrap that over, and I find if you just give the bias binding a little pull, very slight only, it helps keep it all in place. And we just sew along that top pocket edge, and I'm sewing about a millimetre from the edge of the binding. Back tack at each end, take it out of the machine, cut your threads and snip the binding, and then trim the other side. And so there it is from the front, and from the back you can see it's all nicely sewn down. So I'm just going to give that a press. Next, I'm going to take the left side front piece, and on here I have marked where my notches are for the pocket placement and also for the tie placement. But you want to make sure that when you do that, you don't snip into it, because we're binding these seams, so we don't want to have any snips that might accidentally fray and come out of the binding. So I've just used an erasable marker pen, but of course I've checked first to make sure that it does in fact erase. So I take my pocket piece and I'm just going to place it on top of my markers, and I'm just going to use a couple of pins to hold it in place. You don't need a lot of pins for this. And what I'm going to do is sew down this side close to the seam allowance just to secure it and stop it from moving, then across the bottom of the pocket where I've folded up my seam allowance, and I'll be sewing about a millimetre from that edge, and then back up the side just to hold that in place. Make sure you do keep very close to the seam allowance for this part, because when we sew that seam we don't want any of that basting stitching showing through. And we take it out of the machine. And you can see I've just stitched that along the edge. It's very discreet and it's sitting nice and flat. Next, I'm going to sew this side front piece to the center front. Now normally we would sew right sides together, but in this instance we're actually going to be sewing wrong sides together, because we want the seam coming to the front and we're actually going to conceal it with bias binding to create a boning channel. So this project doesn't require any overlocking at all. So I'm going to start off by matching up at the top. My seam allowance is 1 centimetre. Back tack. And sew all the way down that side front seam. Take that out, trim off your threads, and there's one seam done. Now I'm going to sew the other seam. Again, right sides together, and because I started from the top on that one, I'm going to start from the bottom on the other side, so that if there's any movement in the fabric, it's all continuous and matching. And snip those threads. Next, I'm going to actually trim back this seam. Now, I could have used a smaller seam allowance, it's true, but I find it easier to sew with a slightly bigger seam allowance and trim it back. I find that I have more control of the fabric. So I'm going to trim this back to about 3 millimeters, being careful not to get too close. And after that, I'm just going to give it a press, and I will press the seam towards the center front. So you can see there's the original seam, and there it is trimmed back. I'll do the other side. There's both seams done. Now I'm going to give that a press. I've pressed my seam allowances towards the front, and I've checked also on the back to make sure there's no folds underneath, because it's going over a curve and that can sometimes happen. And the reason I press it towards the front is because of the bulk of this pocket here. If I press that seam towards the front, it makes it easy to sew the bias binding on top, whereas if I pressed it towards the side, that would be folding back on itself and creating additional bulk. So to sew the bias binding down the front, I'm using my narrow binding that I've made. Just unwind a bit. And I find it easier just to start off with a little bit over the edge. It just gives me some purchase for my foot, and I find that it just sews better. And that's just my machine. So I'm placing the binding so that where the folded edges of the bias taper are going to sit exactly on the seam. Now, going over that curve, it's a little bit tricky, but if we just get started, what I like to do is just use my hands to gently pull the fabric on each side, so not top and bottom, but sideways, and just sewing a little bit at a time, like so. And then when we come into that straighter area, you can speed up a bit because it's just easy. When we come towards the end, I just cut it off. Again, I leave just a little bit of a tail, and I'm going to sew across the bottom and then come back up towards the top. Complete the seam, take it out of the machine and cut the end of the bias off on top and bottom. You can see my bias tape is sewn over the seam, and from the wrong side, that seam is beautifully concealed. It makes for such a nice, neat finish. And now I'm going to do the other side. This time, I'm going to start from the bottom. This time, because I'm coming towards the top, I need to leave an opening for the boning to go through. So I'm just going to do a little back tack, lift my foot, and just bring the foot over. You could cut it off, but I just find this helps save on thread. As I'm coming back down, I'm really making sure to pull that seam sideways to ensure there's no pleating or folding underneath. Trim the threads and the bias tape. And I'm going to give that a press. How pretty does it look with all the contrasting but matching colours in these different fabrics? Now I'm ready to insert my boning. So I've cut 2 lengths of fishbone here, but you could also use cable ties that you can get from the hardware shop. They're fantastic, and I would definitely recommend them over using, say, Ridgeline, which can poke through. So I've cut those edges and I've used paper cutting scissors, not my fabric scissors, and what I like to do is just trim the ends to create a curve so that it isn't sharp. You can see that the cut edge is very straight and could be sharp, and we don't want it poking through. You could also use a nail file just to smooth off those edges. Now on your pattern you have the markers for where to sew across your bias binding for the boning channels, but if you can't be bothered getting up like I can't, what I'm going to do is just place my boning over my boning channel like this, leaving a 1 centimetre gap at the top because I don't want to have to sew through that plastic, and I'm just going to pop a pin across the boning channel to mark where I need to stop. So same on the other side. Pop a pin in. And now I'm just going to sew across that bias binding. Put a pin in so it faces me and is easy to take out. So I'm just going to pop that on top, and I'm just going to sew across 3 times. Like so, and you don't want your stitch length to be too long. So mark this side again. And trim those threads. On the wrong side. And now I'm ready to thread my boning into those channels. So often you'll find that the boning has a natural curve to it like this. So I'm going to put the curve in so that it's that way, so that at the top of the corset it's pushing into the edge, because if I did it that way, which might feel natural because you'd want it curving into your waist, it's actually going to cause the top part to poke out and it won't sit nicely over your bust. Whereas you've got the ties on the side which will pull this in to fit into the curve of the waist. So sliding the boning down into its channel. Like so. And we can now pop that to one side while we work on the side ties. Here I have my side ties, and I'm just going to bind the edges. So like before, I'm just going to pop the binding underneath my foot and do a few stitches to get started, and then I'm going to lift the foot and slide the fabric into the fold of the bias and do a little back tack at the end. And I'm just going to do this in one pass, but certainly you could do it in 2 if that's how you prefer, and I've got that in the written instructions. So that's folded over, sewing along the edge, giving the binding just a very slight pull so that it cups the fabric, because don't forget, bias binding is quite stretchy. Now I'm coming up to this curve of the tie, and that can be a little bit tricky, so just take your time. And you can see I'm just wrapping the bias and giving it a little pull to curve around that tie. Just sewing a few stitches at a time. And for less experienced sewers, certainly this might be easier to sew in one pass, but you know what? You never know until you give it a go. And down the edge, and you can see that actually that's sitting beautifully, and once it has a press, it's going to be so nice and flat. Back tack at the end, and I like to chain on. Chaining on is where you don't take the fabric out of the machine, you just carry on sewing. I actually have a join in my bias tape at this point, so I'm going to just start my next strap a bit further down so I don't have that bulk at the seam, but if I didn't have that join there, I would actually be starting right up there. Come to the end and trim my threads and my binding. If you didn't feel comfortable binding the edges of your straps, you could also line them and bag them out, and that might make getting that curve easier for you if you don't feel so confident. I've just given my ties a press, and how beautiful and neat is that curve. Those ties look gorgeous. Now I'm going to pin them onto my apron. So again, we're going to be pinning wrong sides together, and the other thing to look out for is that on your ties, the one edge is straight and one is slightly curved, so the straight edge is the one that goes at the bottom. So I've made my notches on there, which have disappeared on one side with the pressing, but that's okay. I'll just fold that in half and mark them from the other side. So, and I'm just going to pin those ties in place. So wrong sides together, and then on the other side, wrong sides together. And at this point, I like to stay stitch or baste them in place. So again, just sewing very close to the edge, because we don't want the stitching to show through. This will just stop them from moving when we're sewing the tape around the edges. And there are the ties in place. Now I am ready to start sewing my binding around the edges. So I'm going to do a nice neat diagonal finish on this binding. So I'm going to give myself a bit of room. So my ties are up here, and I'm just going to pop the apron edge against the binding, leaving about 10 centimeters or so up from where I am starting sewing. So little back tack, and just stretching the binding just slightly as I push that cut edge of the apron into the fold of the bias tape. Now I've just sewn past where my strap is, the side tie, and I'm going to stop sewing, leaving a gap so I can complete my bias tape. I'm going to take that out of the machine. Trim my threads, like so. Next, I want to make a marker for where I want the join to be. And I'm going to place the tape on top and pop a, so I'm going to use my erasable pen and just make a mark. I'm just giving that tape a slight pull as well, make a mark there, and then with the other side make a mark, and then I'm just actually going to cut that tape off with a bit of a tail to give myself something to work with, but also just to make it easier to handle. Next, I'm going to open out my tape, take that pin out. I'm just going to draw a line the whole way on the tape, open out the tape on the other side and draw a line the whole way. And what I want is for the tape to cross over at the intersection, so the very middle point of where I've drawn that line. So I'm going to put the two together so that they cross over, like so. I probably could have given myself a little bit more room here. I'm just going to fold that back just to check that I have got my lines crossing over. So you can see the line I've drawn is in line with the pressed center seam of that bias tape. Open that out. Put a pin on the other side. And now I'm going to sew 45-degree angle from the intersection of the two down to that bottom intersection. In fact, I'll just draw that so you can really easily see. You can see. So that's exactly 45 degrees. Back tack at each end and cut your threads off. And just as a precaution, before I trim those, I just like to open that out and check that it is in fact matching, which it is. So now I'm going to trim back the seam allowances, so just to about 3 millimeters on that side, and same on that side. Trim the little triangles off so they don't get in the way. And then I'm just going to complete that little seam. So tucking that edge, the edges in. In fact, you might even want to just either go and give that a press, or I just like to finger press. If you run your nail along a seam, particularly with something like cotton or linen, it'll just nicely finger press. And pop that into the seam. So going back to where the seam finished at the top, and I'm just going to do it on the right side. So I'm going to over sew by just 1 centimetre. Check that it's tucked underneath, nice and neat. Little back tack. Over sew by 1 centimetre at the other bit. Trim those threads. And how neat is that join? Beautiful. Now, the last thing that we're going to do is we want the binding sitting on top, and that's why we sewed the straps on like this. But if we were to tie them now, that would poke up a little bit. So what I like to do is just do a little bit of top stitching on the edge of the bias down the strap to hold it in place. Trim the threads. And you can see now that's sitting nice and flat. So I'll just do that to the other side. Take that out. So my apron's finished. How quick and easy was that? And no overlocking or serging. And it's beautifully finished on the outside and on the inside. I'm going to give that a press and try it on. So let's try this apron on. You can see with the boning, it's cupping over nicely on the top, and when I tie it on, it is fully self-supported. So there's no strain on my neck from straps, which, you know, makes it practical as well as pretty. So I'm just going to pull that bow. I do the bunny ear method of tying the bow rather than the traditional way because it actually allows the bow to sit flat. I think the contrast binding that I made looks so pretty in my little pocket, and it's those attentions to detail that make it really special. So it's beautiful on the outside and beautiful on the inside. Not a serger inside. I think this makes a great present, but it's also a nice thing to make for yourself. So when you make yours, please tag me at Pattern Union so I can see your project as well.